Good morning, all. Today, primary text. If there's a misprint in the bulletin, I apologize. I don't know if there is, but I see here in my paper it says 2 Kings, but it is not 2 Kings. It is 1 Kings. So I'm not sure what the bulletin says, but we're in 1 Kings chapter 2. We're going to look at the first 4 verses. I'm reading from the NIV. Again, 1 Kings chapter 2. It says, "When the time drew near for David to die, he gave a charge to Solomon his son. I am about to go the way of all of the earth, he said. So be strong, act like a man, and observe what the Lord your God requires. Walk in obedience to him and keep his decrees and commands, his laws and regulations, as written in the law of Moses. Do this so that you may prosper in all you do and wherever you may go, and that the Lord may keep his promise to me. If your descendants watch how they live, and if they walk faithfully before me with all their heart and soul, you will never fail to have a successor on the throne of Israel." All right, I'm going to start by telling you what got me thinking about this particular piece of scripture, which got me rereading Kings. I do this thing when I read the Bible. I don't read it in order, but I cross off the books that I read, so I read it all before I start again, if that makes sense. Even though it's not Genesis to Revelation, I know what I've read, and I thought of something that brought me back to reread Kings before I finished the whole Bible. That's unusual for me. Here's what it is. I don't know if any of you have ever put together a piece of furniture. I have, but only if I can possibly avoid it. I hate it. Not one of those people that come by it naturally. I don't think it's fun. In fact, I find it really, really frustrating. I recently put together a piece of furniture, and I got to say what I find most frustrating about it are the instructions. It seems to me like they are printed on the worst possible paper with the worst possible ink, and you can't clearly see what on earth you're supposed to be doing with these printed images, which way they're supposed to face. So not that long ago, I was working on putting together this dresser, and I realized I had a piece on backwards. I'm like, great. Well, I look at it, and it was kind of an easy switch, just one little screw hole in the bottom and one hole in the top, and I could kind of flip it without taking anything else apart, so I did that. And then I immediately realized I had another piece on backwards. But to fix that piece, I'm on like step 27, and I have to go back to step number 3 to flip this one. Any guesses what I did? It's still backwards. Yeah, exactly. I left it and I improvised with some glue, and it works. At least it works good enough to make it not worth going back all the way to step 3 to fix it. So as I was improvising with this piece, I thought back to the last time I assembled a piece of furniture when I swore I would never, ever, ever do it again. In fact, this last piece of furniture has the only product review I can ever remember writing. I may give a product like stars if it asks you for stars, but this prompted an actual written review. And they say everything on the internet lives forever, and it must, because it did not take a very long search for me to discover the last time I put a piece of furniture together was October 11th, 2016, because that's when the review was written. And for your entertainment, I am going to share that review with you today. It says, "I've nearly finished this desk for my daughter. I'm writing this review with the desk nearly finished because that is all it will ever be. I can't get the slide piece apart for me to put one part on the desk and one part in the drawer. These instructions are useless. Therefore, this desk does not have a drawer. It will never have a drawer. It has a cubby. The desk itself is strong and beautiful. My daughter loves it as it is, and I'm glad because the instructions and labeling were clearly done by Lucifer himself. I also strongly suspect they were translated from ancient Phoenician through a game of telephone before they were printed next to a smudged and useless diagram that must have been dropped in mud and then cleaned with charcoal before being copied for mass distribution. I only recommend purchasing this desk if you can first find a video or blog of someone much smarter than me who successfully put this thing together and will walk you through it. I was unable to find such help. May you fare better." So that is the last time I attempted to put furniture together. As you can see, my frustration with assembly is not a new thing. Instructions are still my primary complaint, apparently. They just never seem clear to me. And you are probably wondering what on earth that has to do with the scripture we just read. We'll see, when I was frustrated with this recent set of directions, when I couldn't make enough sense of them for them to be any use to me, I started thinking about how we sometimes do the same thing with God's instructions. See, we have this book. This book is the basis on which we live our lives. It's not only the basis on which we live our lives, we stake the entirety of our lives on it, on the truth of it. We build our church on it. Our book of discipline references scripture throughout, because this book is the basis of that book. That's the only thing that makes that book any good. This book is how we determine how we should live. But when we're in the middle of it, and by it, I mean when we are in the middle of living, we sometimes take a more narrow view of life because our circumstances are forcing us to, frankly. Sometimes when that happens, these instructions, they don't quite seem so clear. They don't seem so useful. We can feel like we can't see the details clearly. We can't see what we're supposed to do. We can't understand the next step. I can remember talking with a woman from a church in Pennsylvania, and she said to me, "I read the Bible, I really do, but I just wish Jesus would sit on the corner of my bed each morning and tell me exactly what to do for the day." I think we all know what she means. There are times we can all relate to that. I don't know if any of you remember when Candy Crush first came out. I used to play that a lot when it did. I had friends that played it, and we would compete, and I could beat all of them except Pastor Chuck. We used to play against each other, and he always beat my score. Just by a little bit, but he always beat it, and I could not get ahead of him, and it drove me nuts. So for one day I tried this thing where in the game, if you can't figure out a valid move to make, it will suggest one to you. So for a couple of days I tried this thing where I didn't make a single move on my own. I waited for the game to suggest one because I was kind of hoping it would give me the best possible moves and I would beat his score. It didn't. I lost even more spectacularly following the suggested moves. But that got me thinking about how there have been times in my life when, like that woman who wanted Jesus to just lay out her day step by step, for me, I kind of wanted him to be like the recommended move in Candy Crush. Please just tell me exactly what to do and I'll do that. And then tell me exactly what to do and I'll do that. But it doesn't work that way. Just because it doesn't work that way doesn't mean we aren't given instructions. In the verses we just read here, in chapter 2 of 1 Kings, David, he's about to die. We know David had some issues with his children in 2 Samuel. In chapter 15, you can read about a conflict that you're probably familiar with between David and his son Absalom. Absalom, he gathers support for himself. He instigates a rebellion against David. He wants to take the throne. This attempt, it ends up costing Absalom his life, and it causes his father David a whole lot of grief. Even in the first chapter of 1 Kings, we have another son, Absalom's brother, Adonijah. He is intending to take the throne. He's decided. But the throne had been promised to Solomon by David. David honors his word. And then in the second chapter, which we are about to read, David gives final advice to Solomon. He doesn't always handle his children well. In fact, in that first chapter of Kings, when he's having trouble with the kingdom, with the second son, it says in verse 6, his father, meaning David, had never rebuked him by asking, "Why do you behave as you do?" But when he's about to die, he's thinking, what charge do I give my son? So I'm gonna reread those verses in chapter 2. It says, when the time drew near for David to die, he gave a charge to Solomon his son. "I'm about to go the way of all the earth," he said, "so be strong, act like a man, and observe what the Lord your God requires. Walk in obedience to him and keep his decrees and commands, his laws and regulations, as written in the law of Moses. Do this so that you may prosper in all you do and wherever you go, and that the Lord may keep his watch, and that the Lord may keep his promise to me. If your descendants watch how they live, and if they walk faithfully before me with all their heart and soul, you will never fail to have a successor on the throne of Israel. I was thinking about as much as we may want those day-to-day instructions from God, those instructions that are going to cover every single step of our lives. Sometimes we don't realize that we already have them. And sometimes we, and by we I mean me, I get this idea that if I only had a specific manual for my specific life, then I would get it to go perfectly. Problem is, I forget what Jesus said our life going perfectly is going to look like. And we find that in John 16:33. We have Jesus speaking to his disciples. It says, I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart. I have overcome the world. So our life going perfectly, it doesn't mean that it will look perfect according to our ideal, according to how we think it should go. It means that we will have trouble, 100% guaranteed, and there is no suggested Candy Crush move that's going to avoid that trouble. We are going to have it. And if you are here and you've been alive longer than 10 minutes, you can probably testify we are going to have a lot of it. And in fact, if we look at the stories of our founders of the faith that we have recorded here in Scripture, if they're any indication, we are definitely going to have a lot of trouble. The key is having the peace of Jesus in the midst of that trouble, in the middle of that day-to-day living, when we sometimes aren't sure of the specific thing to do. We need to follow him in the bigger picture. I think we often have a better view of the bigger picture when we're at the end of something. For example, it was not until the end of my building project when I decided why that particular piece needed the other way. I couldn't see it when I was putting it together back on step 3. If I could, I wouldn't have made the mistake, but I couldn't in my mind visualize how the pieces fit together. Just like that, for me at least, it's usually not until I'm at the end of a difficult period in my life that I can see how that time can be used by God to benefit us in the whole of our life. And I was also thinking, the funeral yesterday, I was thinking about my father's passing. It's at the end of our life that we usually allow ourselves to have real clarity about what really matters, what the root of our focus should actually be. Before my father died, when he was in the hospital on hospice care, during his final hours, the last hours of his life he spent speaking with each of his children, one at a time. I don't know what he told my brothers and sisters, but I very much suspect that it is similar to what I know he told me and my daughter. And I gotta say, it had absolutely nothing to do with the day decisions of life that we get so caught up in when we're living it, that we so desperately want Jesus' clear direction for. At the very end, knowing he had very little time, what my father spoke of was the bigger picture, the most important decision: follow God. Walk according to his path. Work out your own salvation. These are the things that in the last moment he impressed upon us. At the end of his life, when King David was instructing Solomon on what he found most important, he started with the bigger picture. His final words of wisdom begin with a charge to follow God and to walk according to his path. Because you see, it doesn't matter if we are leading a nation or we are leading a state, a county, a family, if we're just leading our own lives. The thing that we need to most do it successfully is God. He is what we need more than anything else in life in order to get through it successfully. I took note of the way David spoke to Solomon and what we can find there. I was thinking how, firstly, we must be sure that God is, in fact, our God. You see, when David speaks to Solomon, he doesn't say, observe what the Lord my God requires, or even what the Lord our God requires. He tells Solomon in verse 3 to observe what the Lord your God requires. It's not enough to just acknowledge God as God. You have to acknowledge him as your God. I have to acknowledge him as my God. A few generations after Solomon, further down the line, we're going to see another king come onto the scene. King's name is Josiah, and he is just a little person. When he becomes king, he's only 8 years old. His father and his father's father and so on, they have made an absolute mess of their lives. They have not observed what the Lord requires, and they certainly haven't acknowledged him as their Lord. As a result of that, their lives were a mess, and the kingdom was a mess. Josiah's father, his name was Ammon, and he was so terrible that he was killed by his own servants after barely reigning for 2 years. And then we have poor Josiah. He is placed on the throne practically before he can cut his own meat on his plate. Just 8, and he has absolutely no idea what to do. But he does have a lot of ideas of what he doesn't want to do from the past examples he has seen. So what Scripture tells us Josiah does is he looks back in history. He looks past his father and he looks past his grandfather, on and on and on. And he comes to King David, and little Josiah at 8 years old says, I want to be a king like him. And so Josiah models his life after David. Scripture tells us he walked in the ways of his father David. He followed David. And while following David, something happens. Josiah, he starts to focus on the things that David focused on. The things that were important to David become important to Josiah. So the temple becomes a focus again. And during the 18th year of his reign, almost 2 decades he's been on the throne, the high priest Hilkiah, he finds the book of the law in the temple. He gives the book of the law to Josiah's secretary Shaphan, and Shaphan brings it to Josiah and reads it to him. And Josiah, he is horrified at how far they as a nation have fallen from God. He repents, he implements the instructions that we find in God's law, and something amazing happens. Where Scripture once said, all throughout Josiah's story, Josiah followed his father David. After the reading of the law, Scripture tells us, and Josiah followed the Lord. Scripture tells us that there is no king like Solomon with his wealth and wisdom, but honestly, I think in Scripture, Josiah gets the higher praise. In 2 Kings 23, verse 25, it tells us, neither before nor after Josiah was there a king like him who turned to the Lord as he did, with all his heart and with all his soul and with all his strength, in accordance with the law of Moses. See, Josiah made his relationship with God personal. He no longer followed David, who followed the Lord. He followed the Lord, his Lord, for himself. I think that Josiah understood what David is trying to impress on Solomon here. Observe what the Lord your God requires, walk in obedience to him, and keep his decrees and commands. I think Josiah understood the greatest commandment, which Jesus reiterates for us in Mark 12:30. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. I noticed in preparing for this week that Jesus says your God as well. Love the Lord your God. The foremost way that we begin to understand the application of the instructions we are given is by adopting the author of the instructions as our own. I was thinking as I was assembling that dresser how much I would very much have liked to had the person who wrote the instructions sitting next to me telling me exactly what they mean. Guess what we do? We have direct access to the author of our instructions. I think when we understand that he is our God, not just God, but our God, and that we belong to him, it's easier to walk in obedience to him and to follow him just for the sake of following him alone, because we love him with all that we are. And that is the next step after to own him as our own. It's to follow him. David says, walk in obedience to him. And if we truly own him as our own, Following him, for the most part, will come naturally. Jesus tells us in John 10, verse 27, "My sheep listen to my voice. I know them, and they follow me." Making him our own and following naturally out of love will lead us to the illumination that we need. Jesus again speaking in John 8, in verse 12, it says, "When Jesus spoke again to the people, he said, 'I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life.'" Physical death may be inevitable, as David realized when he told Solomon, "I am about to go the way of all the earth." All the earth. But if we make God our own, we will never, ever see spiritual death. We see as Jesus explained that to the grieving sisters of Lazarus just before he physically raises Lazarus from the dead. In John 11:25, it says, Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die." After my dad died, I got one of his Bibles. And inside it, there was a scrap of paper on which he had handwritten a Bible verse. I think it's one of the last things he wrote because it was very shakily written. It didn't look like his normal handwriting. What he wrote out was Matthew 6, verses 19 through 21. And those say, "Do not store up for yourselves treasure on earth, where moths and vermin destroy, and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasure in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." When we remember where our treasure is and where our heart should be, I think it's easier to accept not necessarily having the detailed instructions that we might want. I can get the frustration with not having them. I really can. I understand what it's like to want to know exactly how we should handle day-to-day living. For example, I would very much like specific instructions on what exactly each of you would need from me individually so that you can best feel the love and presence of God. I would like to know how and when to speak to the people I encounter every day. I want the specific words to make clear to them how important it is to make Jesus the first priority in their lives. I would especially want that immediately after a conversation in which I'm walking away thinking that did not go well at all. I would even like specific words for my family. What do I say when they're hurting or frustrated or lost or confused? I was thinking this past week about my daughter. I've mentioned before in services, so most of you know if you've been here, our relationship is strained. I don't have chances to talk to her often. I haven't had a chance to talk to her for a long time. I've tried to follow God's guidance with that, to speak when he says speak, to give her space when he says give her space. I'm not sure I always get it right, but I do my best. Lately, I've been feeling like I want to write her a letter, so I'm trying to pray to make sure that is God wanting me to write her a letter and not me wanting to write her a letter. I'm probably going to spend a couple days fasting over it, just take some time before I do it. Not even certain I have the correct address for her, but if she is meant to have it, that's okay, because I know a guy bigger than the United States Postal System, and she will get it. But I say this to say that I have been thinking, if I write this letter, what do I say? And then I thought further, if I only had a sentence or two to say, she only reads the beginning. If, like David, I feel like my time is short and I want to make the most of it, if I want to leave something for my daughter, not just my daughter, but anyone of great value to me, what words would they be? And if I'm being honest, they wouldn't have a single thing to do with the pressing issues of day-to-day life that I so often want my minute-by-minute instructions before. In fact, the more I thought about it, they would be exactly what David passed on to Solomon. Observe what the Lord your God requires. Walk in obedience to him. Keep his decrees and commands, because that's what matters, not the other things. And I think that viewing the now in the light of eternity helps us to understand that, and to understand that, well, yes, we will have trouble in this world. Our God has overcome the world. I mentioned my niece Emily either last week or the week before, I can't remember which, how this month was supposed to be her wedding. Her wedding date is coming up soon, but her fiance passed in an accident last year. She's grieving. I've been thinking about her grieving as well. And this past week, something came to mind that she had wrote on Facebook years ago, when things were going pretty well for her, when her faith was stronger and not so shaky, and it stuck with me. I thought about it from time to time, and it came to mind again this past week. She wrote about eating chocolate, and while she was eating the chocolate, her dog was there begging for a piece, because she usually gave her dog a piece of whatever she was eating, but because chocolate's harmful for dogs, Emily would not give her dog a piece of this chocolate. So Emily, she writes that she explained this to the dog. She laid it all out, told the dog that because she loved her, that she couldn't give her the one thing she desperately wanted. And the dog didn't care. The dog just wanted the chocolate. And Emily wrote that she could imagine that God often looked at her the same way. That he answered her the same way regarding things that she wanted so desperately in her life. I went and found her post, and she wrote, "My sweet girl, I know you want it. I know right now you want it more than anything else in this life, but because I love you, I can't give it to you. You can't see it. All you can see is how enticing it looks and how much you think you need it, but I can see how much it will hurt you to get it, even if I know you'll enjoy it in the moment. And so I'm keeping it from you, and I know you don't understand, but because you know me, I hope you can trust that what I give and what I withhold, I give and I withhold for a reason." Now, in the middle of her grief, I have been praying this prayer for Emily that she wrote herself, that she can find this understanding again, that she can again come to know that what her God gives and what her God withholds, he does for a reason. And that reason always includes our benefit, even if it doesn't seem like it. Whatever you're in the middle of, as I bring our praise team forward and we prepare to close, what I want to invite us to today is to realize that as much as we want those detailed instructions sometimes, and as much as we want the clear picture where we can see the next step, God has already given us exactly what we need. And any step-by-step instructions that we don't get, I believe he only withholds them for good reason, not to hurt us in any way. And he has given us all that we need to know for the only success that matters in life. We find it here in 1 Kings chapter 2. Walk in obedience to him, keep his decrees and commands. In Micah 6:8, it says, "He has shown you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God." This week, my prayer is that we all look for and find opportunities